We're going to be talking about spring. So let me set the tone this way. Can you remember like the coldest that you've ever been? Like when you think about in life, like when was the time that you were the absolute coldest? So my wife would say like that's every day of her life as she feels cold. But the time for me is my very first job where I got paid any amount of money was when I was about a 12 or 13-year-old boy. I did an old school paper route, okay? So we lived in a bigger city, and what that meant is every day after school, I would get this stack of newspapers, and I would fold them and put them in my big basket on the front of my bike, and I would drive through neighborhoods on my bike and deliver newspapers. Anybody else ever have this job? A few of you. Okay. So that was kind of the first job for a teenager, and then things got really dangerous, and you could no longer do that because a 13-year-old boy couldn't go knocking on people's door asking for money any longer. So what's full circle for me, this is so ironic. When I was an adult trying to pay my way through school at one point, I had a newspaper route as well. But that was like 3 a.m. in the morning, 7 days a week, put them in my car and deliver them that way. But back to my story, 12, 13 years old. You had to deliver the papers. And my dad was just the type that was like, no, it's your job to deliver the papers. I don't care what the temperature is or the season is or the weather is. You get out and do your job. And so I did that. And then one time, again, we're living in eastern North Carolina, so we got a little different weather than here at times. It snows more there. And so it had snowed, and it was freezing cold outside. And it came time for me to deliver papers, and I was hesitant to do it. Dad's like, no, bundle up, do your job, go deliver your papers. So I did. When I came home, I pulled off my winter hat, which we call a toboggan here in the South. You guys realize, like, nowhere else in the world do they call that a toboggan. That's only in the South. When I first said toboggan to Ashley, she was like, you're putting a sled on your head? What are you talking about? And so I pulled off my toboggan. You guys all know what I'm talking about. Winter hat to other people in the world listening. I pulled off my toboggan, and my ears were frostbit from the weather. And so what that means is my ears were about 10 times the size of normal. I was like Dumbo in person. My ears were like 7 inches thick. They were like swollen up. I'm this 12-year-old kid. My brother is humiliating me like nonstop, like laughing uncontrollably, holding his belly. Look at Devin's ears, like on and on and on. Now, that doesn't seem like a big deal now because my head is kind of caught up with my ears. I'm one of those people, my ears have been the same size since I was born. Like literally, this was the size of my ears when I was born. So it's okay to have these size ears now. They look normal, but you put these ears on a little bitty baby head, those things look humongous. And so I was kind of still going through that phase where my ears were my head's kind of trying to catch up with my ears, and then they're 10 times the size. And I knew it was bad when my parents laughed at me. Like, it's one thing for your brother to make fun of you, but when your parents can't control their laughter, like, my dad allowed me to eat dinner in the bedroom that night. And so that was my coldest moment in life, was my frostbit ears episode. I still have scars from it, I can tell you. So I was cold, but I was not like Antarctica cold. Anybody ever seen the March of the Penguins? And so the March of the Penguins, kind of this documentary movie about the penguins and kind of how they migrate. And they're all in Antarctica where like humans can't survive. And it's funny to me in the March of the Penguins because there's parts of scenes. Now it gets 140 below in Antarctica, so that's cold. And there's scenes in the March of the Penguins where the penguins are all like huddled together trying to survive. And like if a penguin gets cold, you know it is cold. And so it wasn't like that type of cold. But no matter how cold you've ever been, the coldest moment in your life, what you're looking forward to is warmth, right? Getting out of the cold and being warm. When you are cold, there's this anticipation of warmth. Like we all have watched movies and TV shows and different things, or been in cases where we were really cold, and the only way to survive was to get around that fire. Like there's lots of movies out there, like people out in the cold and lost different places, and their only means of survival is to be around that fire. And so the good news when we're talking about seasons is that the winter season gives way to spring. That spring is this incredible, great season, right? So we're like on the edge of spring coming up, and so many great things happen in spring, like the temperatures become more moderate. It's not like the blistering heat of the summer with the high humidity, and it's not the cold. It's kind of more of a moderate temperature. Daylight returns. I know you have to spring forward an hour every time, or if you're like Ash's desire is that every single time we fall back, like, right? She doesn't want to do the spring forward with her clock. She's just like, can we fall back again? But you have to spring forward, but that gives you more daylight. The birds come back, so you hear the birds again. The flowers bloom again. The leaves return. You can go outside. You can open your windows at your house and let the breeze in. Stuff turns green in the spring, right? Also, if you live in the South, stuff turns yellow. You come outside and your car's covered in yellow. The pollen comes back. And so we live in this season that is awesome because it ushers in this feeling of life and hope and happiness and allergies, for those of you that do not get along with the pollen. But spring is a great season of the year. And so what we've been talking about in this series, this season series, is how do we abide in Christ? This is our big picture, our kind of the tagline of the whole series. How do we abide in Christ during every season of the soul? That our soul goes through seasons, through changes. Now, how do we abide in Christ when my heart, my soul is going through these different seasons? And last week we talked about winter. And that winter leaves us with this feeling because there tends to be a gap between what we know about God and what we feel about God in the wintertime. That our beliefs, our theology, and our experiences are not the same when we're going through winter. Because winter leaves us feeling empty and alone. Because winter introduces, it brings the intrusion of death into our lives. That everything looks and feels dead, including us at times. And might even wish that we were dead sometimes in the winter seasons of soul. And what we said last week is how the winter season of the soul pushes us into the gospel is because it is in that season where Jesus, the man of sorrows, meets us and where he is patient with us and where he patiently waits and prunes and deepens our faith and ultimately leads us out of that season, out of that winter season. And I would suggest that he most often leaves us out of winter and into spring, which is what we're going to talk about today, that death most often gives way to life. So I'm going to read Isaiah chapter 35, and then we're going to come down and break down this passage as we go through it together. Isaiah 35 is this chapter that kind of captures the idea of the springtime of the heart. So let's read this together. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It blossoms abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands, make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame man shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. For waters break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals where they lie down, the grass shall become reeds and rushes. And a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it. It shall belong to those who walk on the way, even if they are fools. They shall not go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. And so we're going to break down what Isaiah was talking about in this chapter, but he really captures the idea of a springtime of the heart, of this transformation of the winter of the soul into the spring of the soul. Now, Isaiah 35 is God's word that was written to his people, and what he's saying in this chapter really is that this idea of this joy, this everlasting joy, is on the horizon. Like, it is coming. It is just around the corner, that the desert and the dry land shall become an oasis. The very opening words he uses is that they shall blossom abundantly like the crocus. Now, how many of us know what the crocus is? And it is the crocus, not the crocus, not Crocs. How many of you own a pair of Crocs? Okay, that's okay. Levi owns some too. They're kind of like the lazy person's shoe, aren't they? But we're not talking about Crocs here. We're talking about the crocus. How many of you know what a crocus is? All right? A lot of ladies raise their hands. Let's put up a picture of the crocus. There we go. So how many of you now recognize kind of the crocus? This is the crocus. I'm about to impress you with my crocus knowledge. So be prepared. Crocus is one of the first flowers to emerge in the spring. In certain parts of the country, the crocus blooms while there is still snow on the ground, as a matter of fact. It is a part of the iris family. It's comprised of 90 species of perennials. Wow, aren't you impressed with my crocus knowledge? 90 species. It's often referred to as the light bulb flower because it appears as a bright light bulb until these petals unfurl into this cup-shaped flower like the picture that you see. Now, before you get too excited that I'm a flower expert, let me just tell you that Google can tell you a lot of information, and Google can tell you a lot about the crocus. And so I thought I would go next level outside of what is crocus and say, well, what is the term for a flower expert? And so I Googled flower experts, thinking I was going to get this, scientific term for an expert of flowers. And the official term for a flower expert, ready for it? You might want to write this down. The official term for a flower expert is, ready? Gardener. I'm like, that can't be right. It's got to be more than gardener. So I'm Googling again. That's not right. Give me, flower expert round 2. I want to Google something else. What is flower expert? And it's pops up again, gardener. Man, every time Google makes you feel really dumb. In that moment, I felt really dumb. I thought it was going to be some word that ends with, ologist, right, of some sort. But it was gardener. And so gardeners out there know that about the crocus. And so this passage says that the desert gives way to this abundant, this blooming of the crocus, that it blossoms abundantly. So some of you, like me, might be a little fascinated at times with Planet Earth documentaries. I don't spend a lot of time watching them, but when they're on and I'm kind of flipping through channels, I get kind of fascinated with what's happening around our world. One of my favorite Planet Earth documentaries that I have watched portions of has to do with the African plains, the desert lands of South Africa and other places. It's extremely fascinating to watch, a Planet Earth documentary about what happens in the desert lands of South Africa. And we've kind of all seen this where, there's this kind of barren desert season that happens, and you have all these really kind of skinny and gaunt animals that are kind of slowly making their way through the desert. It's hot, and it's dry, and it's barren, and the water dries up, and there's very few animals that are even out that can survive in it. And if there are out, you can kind of see them coming because there's just giant dust cloud that follows them, and particularly if it's a big elephant or something. But the animals, again, are barely surviving. And many animals don't survive. They don't survive that season. And when you see those documentaries, you see them kind of making their way through this desert land, and there's skeletons and dead trees, and the land just looks barren. And then the seasonal rains come, and everything changes. And the land becomes plush and gracious, and it overflows with greenness. We've been sponsoring these 3 children that live in South Africa for most of my kids' lives, so about 10, 15, 18 years now, a few of them. And whenever they write to us, they write things like, hey, pray for the rain season to come. Pray for the rain to come on our land. Because they live in that climate that's extremely desert, and the rain is what enables them to survive. And so when these seasonal rains arrive in these documentaries, there's this miracle that unfolds. The waters arrive, and there's grass and trees and life, and this wasteland becomes a playground of vitality. And when you watch the documentary, suddenly there's monkeys out in the trees and going to the common water hole, and there's birds that return, and the elephants are out frolicking in the water, and there's other animals at these giant water holes. The barren desert has been turned into rivers and streams, and this giant lakes form where there's all kinds of waters, including crocodiles. which is another documentary all in itself that's extremely fascinating too. What happens when the crocodiles interact with the other animals? A whole different type of crocs. We're all into the crocs and the croaks and the crocodiles today, aren't we? Third type of croc that's been mentioned in a single sermon. You better write that down. And so this playground of vitality, what happens? Death gives way to life. Look again what Isaiah said here in the last part of verse 6 and verse 7. For waters break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand becomes a pool. The thirsty ground, springs of water. In the haunt of jackals where they lie down, the grass becomes reeds and rushes. What happens? The winter of the heart becomes the spring of life. Now, I love that Isaiah 35 paints this picture of both reality, the wilderness, right? That we live in the wilderness at times in life. And it also gives us the reality of what happens in the springtime. There's this season of hope. One author calls this chapter that what Isaiah does here is Isaiah tells us what it feels like when God is on the move. I love that. When God is on the move. It makes me wonder if that's kind of what C.S. Lewis was thinking when he was thinking about this passage when he wrote The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. If you know the story, if you've watched the movie or read the books, you know that these three kids, they show up through their wardrobe into this crazy land. And when they get there, it's wintertime. There's no spring. There's no Christmas. It's just this perpetual winter. There's this icy grip on the land. And then over the course of the series, and in the movies and in the books in particular, over the course of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, everything changes. And there's this transitional period where they go from this perpetual winter into a springtime. And I love the chapters where Lewis is introducing that imagery, because again, if you know anything about Lewis, you know there's like a lot of spiritual symbolism in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And the lion character in the books and in the movie, Aslan, is the symbol for the Christ. And so the kids are having this conversation because there's these rumblings that are happening throughout the empire that the winter season is breaking, that spring is on the horizon. And here's how the kids phrase it. Spring is coming because Aslan is on the move. The great king is back. What a great symbolism that God is on the move during the winter season of our hearts. What does springtime of the soul feel like? Well, we read Isaiah 35, the tone of it. There's this explosion of joy. The writer uses this language that he was glad, and there's joy and rejoicing greatly and singing and majesty and glory and shout for joy. Now, in the text, as we were kind of going through, what you notice is that when God is on the move, that creation itself responds to the move of God. Not just the people of God, but creation itself responds and rejoices and delights. This is a common Old Testament theme that continues into the New Testament. It is in the New Testament where Jesus speaks and creation itself obeys him. The winds and the waves die down. The rain ceases when Jesus speaks. It is in the New Testament where the creation itself follows the lead, where when Jesus dies on the cross, the scriptures say that the earth mourned because Jesus died. There's this theme throughout Scripture that when God speaks, when God moves, that the creation itself responds to the activity of God. One of the great texts in the Old Testament is that the people of God are encouraged to give praise to God. And the verse is that if we do not give praise to God, that the rocks themselves will cry out to Him. The creation responds to God. So we give voice, we give worship to God. But if we choose to be quiet, God says even the creation itself is praising me, is worshiping me. Now, also implied in this Isaiah text, that it's not just the creation of God that's responding, it's the people of God who experience and express joy when God is on the move. Paul picks up on this in Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 21. Let me read Paul's words there, which again kind of draw from his knowledge of the book of Isaiah. Paul says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time," here we go, winter season, "the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." Then listen to these words of Paul. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to fertility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the freedom of the glory of the who? Of the children of God. Then he goes on to say how the creation is groaning, anticipating for this to take place. So Paul teaches in Romans chapter 8 that creation itself is longing for the movement, the activity of God. But creation takes its lead from the people of God. That the people of God are set free, and creation joins in with the people of God, the celebration of the liberated. That the redeemed people take the lead to celebrate who God is, that God is on the move, and that creation joins in with us in that celebration. One of the most beautiful passages in Isaiah is chapter 55. In Isaiah chapter 55, let me show you here what Paul says. We're just going to do 10 through 12, even though the whole chapter is amazing. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return there, but water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. For you shall go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall break forth into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. So Paul echoes Isaiah 55, where God speaks, and then we, the people of God, the redeemed people of God, we go out with joy. We are led in peace. And then the creation joins in our song. What a beautiful picture of the springtime of the heart. It's a common experience in the springtime of the soul. Notice the pattern here. This common experience in the springtime of the soul. God moves. We respond in worship. And creation is impacted. God moves. God speaks. We respond in worship. And creation is impacted. Now think about that in our everyday lives. Think about that in the life of who we are as City Church. God speaks. God is on the move. And we respond to his activity. We respond to God working and moving in our hearts and our lives as a church. And when that happens, the natural pattern, the natural outflow is that the creation itself around us is impacted. Think about that in your everyday life. As God is working and doing his work in your heart, and you're responding to that in worship, did you know that that makes you a better husband in those times? It makes you a better mother in those times. It makes you a better coworker. It makes you more in tune with opportunities around you to serve and to help and to encourage people. Like, that's the pattern that happens. God moves. God acts in the springtime of our hearts. We respond to God in worship, which heightens our awareness of who God is and who is around us that needs God. The pattern, God acts. We respond. Creation is impacted. Love God. Love others. Now, the springtime of the soul, let's dig down a little bit here. The springtime of the soul is all about renewal. Renewal of the soul. So this renewal springs forth from the winter of the soul. So everything we talked about winter last week, the things that lead us into winter. It may be death. It may be crisis. It may be loss, the loss of a relationship. It may be the loss of a job. It may be depression. It may be some type of life upheaval. It may be uncertainty, sickness, conflict. Like, there's a lot of things that can lead us into the winter of the soul. And when we are in that season, right, winter leaves us parched and dry. And we talked about last week feeling like we'd rather die at times, like the living death that winter brings. We are reminded of death's grip on our world. And then spring arrives. God moves. And if you've been in that season of winter and God has brought you out of that season into the season of spring, you recognize that most often it just happens, right? It just happens. That God just moves, and when springtime arrives, God acts and everything is different. Aslan is on the move. The king, the great king, is back, and everything changes. Our souls are renewed. Our souls are brought to life. And in this text, Isaiah paints this picture of three types of renewal that takes place. The first type of renewal he talks about in the springtime of the soul is an emotional renewal. Look at, again, 35, 3 and 4. Strengthen the weak hands. Make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong and fear not. Behold, your God will come. Now look at this. Will come with vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come and save you. So notice the description here. Those who are weak and feeble and anxious and afraid. Like that's the winter of the soul, isn't it? Those are the things that describe that winter season of the soul. That when you're in winter and your beliefs about God and your experience with God feel very distant, and when you're in the winter season that you may know things about God, but you struggle because you're in this season, and you feel anxious, and you feel afraid, and you feel uncertain, and you feel weak, and you feel feeble. Like that's the winter of the soul, a season where we do not desire this kind of snap out of it pep talk that people really want to give us. You been there? You've been in that season where you had winter of the soul and people with good intentions around you thought that they could snap you out of it with a pep talk. And all that does is like that just heightens the winter, right? Just like leave me alone. I don't want to be bothered during my winter of the soul season. A pep talk will not do anything right now but create a potential homicide, right? Like, you don't want the pep talk. You want to be left alone because your heart hurts. You just want to be left alone. But spring brings this emotional renewal. In the springtime, our heart savors words of encouragement and peace. Now, notice what Isaiah does here. Be strong, fear not, because your God comes with vengeance. He's talking about reparation. He's talking about payback, right? Vengeance is a word that's often used. Your God comes with vengeance. Like that seems like a big question. Like what? Like I'm in winter and now I feel spring because God is getting ready to give some payback. Now, let me tell you about Isaiah's context. When Isaiah's writing these words, they are under this kind of ruthless reign of the Assyrians, who were not good people. They were very evil people. And Isaiah and the people of God are living under the rule and reign of the Assyrians, who took pride in the way they treated people. As a matter of fact, if you kind of get the big picture here, it's why when God said to Jonah, go preach my message to the Ninevites, who were Assyrians, that Jonah said, I don't have anything to do with them. Like I'm going this direction because I don't want the Assyrians to come to know God. Because of how cruel the Assyrians were. So Isaiah was a prophet during the exile to the Assyrians. Now, I don't want to get into a ton of details here, but here's what basically God is saying in these verses. Guess what? The Assyrians do not win. The Assyrians are not in control. The Assyrians do not have the final word. God himself has the final word. And there is coming a time when the enemy will be defeated. So here's what that means for us. Here's the emotional renewal for the child of God living in 2019. It is a reminder that God will set all things right. You hear me? God will set all things right. This could go 1,000 different directions in how that could be applied to your life. Like some of you have gone through things in life where evil has invaded your space or brokenness has invaded your world and has done some things to harm and hurt you that just weren't right. You've been treated in ways that just weren't right because of other people's sins. You have found yourself in a position where you have been abused or taken advantage of or hurt in some way. And our natural tendency is to want to lash out or to become bitter or to be vengeful or to seek revenge in some way. And this passage reminds us that during those winter seasons of the soul, that there is a spring time that is coming where God makes all things new, where God makes all things right. That it's not your job to go out and to figure it out and clean it up and seek revenge, that goes into the hands of God. That our hearts can be encouraged that at the end of the day, evil doesn't win. Sin doesn't win. Now, let me apply this to the big picture here. Here's the primary way that God sets things right. Big D, death does not win. What am I talking about? I'm talking about we all die, right? That's little d, death. We all will face death. But there's big D, death. That when sin entered the world, that death came along with it and impacted everything. Impacted the way we live life, how we interact with people. Our relationships sometimes die because of big D, death. The joy in our heart is ripped away because of big D, death. You grieve and suffer and experience guilt and shame because of big D, death. Big D, death entered the world, and its impact is felt throughout all of creation. But what Isaiah reminds us of here in chapter 35 is that winter loses. Big D, death, was conquered when Jesus died on a cross. And one day, everything that big D, death, impacts will be renewed. It will be restored. It will be brought back to life. In the end, big D, death, doesn't win. Life wins. You know why big D, death, doesn't win? Jesus conquered it. He went into the grave and conquered big D, death, so that we might have life. So when Ash and I were over in Europe to see my oldest daughter, Kaylee, we were doing the normal kind of tourist things in London, and we went to some of the biggest and what's considered the most profound museums in all of the world. And so we walked through a few of these art museums. I have to be honest with you, it lost me after like 5 minutes. But I felt obligated as a tourist to like walk through, 10% of it at least. And so we're walking through, and a lot of the paintings are from like the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period. And a lot of the paintings depicted Jesus, okay? So a lot of Middle Age painters and Renaissance artists, they depict Jesus. And for whatever reason, during that time of art, the depiction most often associated with Jesus was his death. And so you'd see these massive and, from what I understand, extremely expensive paintings from some of the world's most renowned artists about Jesus dying. And you would see Jesus like struggling and pale and limp and bloody and impaled on a cross and lifeless in the arms of his mourners. And so like again and again and again, this was, particularly in kind of that Middle Ages Renaissance part of the museums, that's the depiction of Jesus that you would see. To the point that I got tired of seeing like Jesus being depicted in that way. So here's what I did. I pulled a chair up beside the biggest crucifixion painting, and for like the next 10 minutes, I just screamed at the top of my lungs, "This is not the whole story. It doesn't end this way." Like, I didn't do that really, but in my mind I did. In my mind, I wanted to say to the people looking at the paintings, like, this is part of the story, yes, but this is not the end of it. It doesn't end here. It doesn't end with Jesus impaled on a cross and bloody and beaten and a victim. It doesn't end there. It ends with Jesus coming back to life. Like, this is not the whole story. Death doesn't win in the end. Jesus wins because he conquered death. Like, there's a part 2 to the painting that we're missing from the museum. Does that make sense to you today? He's alive, and he's making all things new. So, follower of Jesus, be encouraged today. Big D, death, does not have the final word. Whatever's been stolen from you, whatever you have lost, whatever's been destroyed in your life, whatever's been ruined, in your life by your sins or others, I want to encourage you that Jesus renews. There is hope. There is life. Springtime is coming. The other type of renewal that Isaiah talks about here is physical renewal. And we're going to kind of get through these last two quickly. Physical renewal. Notice in verse 5 that he talks about this physical renewal. The eyes of the blind are open. The ears of the deaf are unstopped. The lame leaps like a deer. The tongue of the mute sings for joy. So he talks about this physical renewal that happens. I mentioned last week in the winter message about John the Baptist, who was going through winter of the soul, like he had pointed the way to Jesus, and now he finds himself rotting in this prison, and he sends his followers out to Jesus and says, like, I need to know what's going on here. Like, are you the real deal? Are you legit? And Jesus sends the disciples of John back to him to say, like, what's going on? And you know what they quote? They quote Isaiah 35. They say to John, or Jesus says to his followers, go tell John Isaiah 35. Blinded eyes are seeing. Deaf ears are hearing. Like, what's Jesus doing there? He's connecting himself to Isaiah 35. Jesus is saying, I'm the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecies. I'm the one that will bring physical renewal and healing. Now, John, if you pick up again last week, John, are you going to trust me if I leave you in prison? Are you going to trust me in the winter of the soul? And the reason you can trust me in prison, when you're rotting in prison, I'm not going to come hold your hand through the bars. The reason you can trust me even when I don't come is because spring is coming. Because deaf ears are being opened and blinded eyes are seeing. There's a physical renewal that takes place. Now, this can be, applied in a lot of different ways. Sometimes this happens literally and instantaneously. That physical healing happens literally. Like we've heard those stories of people that the doctor said one thing and God said something else and said it's not the way. We have a doctor in our midst that can tell you stories of divine healing that have taken place where there's no human explanation why this is gone or this is healed or this is different. Sometimes that takes place, and I wish there were more and more of those stories in our individual lives. But here's why I think sometimes that's not. God moves and it happens. Most often, a physical renewal follows this emotional renewal that I was talking about. That there's this vitality to the soul that takes place. And so that person that was unable to get out of bed, and that person that was unable to come out of their cloud of darkness, and that person that was unable to connect to their family members or friends who are trying to help them and they don't want to be helped, that person that was experiencing deep levels of depression and loneliness, when God moves, everything changes. There's an emotional renewal that changes the vitality, sometimes physically, of the very person that is being renewed by God himself. You've been there, right? You've been in those times where you felt like I can't get out of bed today. And then God has moved in a way that's brought encouragement to your heart. And I don't know if you're ready to run a 5K, but you feel like it, right? There's a way that God moves in our lives physically. And then here's the other way I want to apply this. Sometimes it's instantaneous that God does this. Sometimes it's vitality to those whose emotions are renewed. Like Isaiah says in other passages, God renews their strength and they mount up on wings like eagles. He gives life to their soul. But here's the other one. Even those who face the brutal reality of small d death, even when the cancer remains, even when the mind fades, even when the limbs deteriorate, there is a promise of physical renewal that brings us hope. Paul says, death has lost its sting. Here's how death has lost its sting. Here's how even when we face small d death, that big D death doesn't win. Here's how it takes place. There's no cancer in heaven. Right? There's no Parkinson's in heaven. There's no sickness in heaven. There's no Alzheimer's in heaven. There's no arthritis and his cousin bursitis in heaven. Right? Those things don't exist. Why? Because the brokenness is taken away. And there is coming a time when all of God's followers, the redeemed, will experience complete and full physical renewal, driving us back to the creation itself. When God opened the pages of this story, creating humanity, that we are pushing back toward that. Big D, death, doesn't win. And here's the last type of renewal in our passage, moral renewal. There's a moral renewal that takes place. Verse 8, and a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it. It shall belong to those who walk in the way. Even if they are fools, they shall not go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. In the spring of our hearts, God cleanses us. He cleanses our hearts. When He is bringing us out of that winter season, part of being brought out is the renewal of heart that takes place. The bitterness is removed. The anger is taken away. The sin is repented of and dealt with. Jealousy is removed. Lust is taken away. Why? Because God sanctifies. God redeems. God restores. Remember how David described it in Psalm 51? God, bring back, restore the joy of my salvation. When he was in his winter season, which, by the way, was brought on by his own sin, right? When he was in his winter season of the soul, and God felt very removed from him, and David had a heart that was, initiated by his repentance and finding forgiveness in God, that his prayer was, God, bring back the joy of my salvation. That my joy has been removed, but spring ushers in that return, that restoration of joy and fulfillment. So we're talking about renewal here. We're talking about vindication. We're talking about restoration. We're talking about sanctification. We're talking about emotional renewal and physical renewal and moral renewal. We're talking about renewal. Spring is here. God is on the move, and He is making all things new. Wake up. Wake up, my soul. Spring is here. Spring wakes us up. It revitalizes. So how do we respond to this? As I did last week, let me just mention a couple of things. What is spring's work? What is spring's work? Jesus working in us. And as we are living in the gospel, as we work out these things, let me just mention a few. One, plowing. Spring's work, plowing. You see, renewal is a gift. It's an opportunity. A field that is unplowed is an opportunity that is wasted. For the first time since we've been living in our current house, we've decided not to plant anything, our small deteriorating garden. Do not be sad for us. Trust me. All it's doing is saving us a lot of emotional heartache. We're not going to plant anything. But before this year, we had awesome men in our church that would come and bring their tools that someone like me doesn't own, and they plow up our ground. They get it ready to put the seeds in and put the tomato plants in. So good news, gentlemen, you don't have to make a trip to my house this spring. You can come for other reasons, but you don't have to do work while you're there. And so we're not going to plant anything this year. I've just decided that emotionally and even materially with my money, I'm cheaper to buy tomatoes at the farmer's market. Are you kidding me? And they look so much better. Or you can just bring us tomatoes now that I've announced that. But a field unplowed is a wasted opportunity. And spring provides an opportunity for us to sow seed that we will harvest later. What I'm telling you is in the spring seasons of your soul, do the work. Do the work. I'm going to mention just one. Do the work. And here's the one I'm going to mention. Be attentive. Be listening. Because God is on the move. You know what happens in winter? We can't hear. We talked about it last week. What we believe about God and what we feel about God is often very removed. And sometimes we can't hear, and we wonder if God's even listening during the winter of the soul. But in the springtime, we're renewed. We're renewed emotionally, spiritually, physically. And so in the spring is when we do the work of listening. Because renewal brings a freshness to our time with God. Like you've been there if you've been a Jesus follower for any length of time. Like it's in the spring that I encourage you, develop your holy habits. Get the Bible in you. Talk to God in the spring of the soul. Be attentive. It's often during the spring of the soul that God provides direction to our lives for the other seasons. Be attentive. Listen. He's plowing. He's doing His work in you. And so you do your plowing. Do your work. Be attentive. Listen during the spring of the soul. The second one I would mention in doing spring's work is planting. We will not be plowing, therefore we will not be planting. If you plow, you need to plant. Spring is a season of action. It's a season of newness, of life. Spring is a great time. Spring of the soul is a great time to start new things, to capitalize on opportunities. You listen to where God is leading, and then you act. What is God inviting you to be a part of? What is God asking you to start? What is God asking you to step out of and to be invested in and to be a part of? It is time to plant, to sow the seed so that you might reap later. Now, let me say this. I want to offer a word of encouragement today. Some of you sitting in the seats like you're in winter season of the soul, or you've been recently in a winter season of the soul. Some of you are at City Church because you are going through a winter season of the soul. Then you need to sit in a seat and listen and try to hear from God. But here's what I want to encourage you. Like as God is doing His work and He's renewing you and your soul is being brought to life and you're finding vitality and you have a hunger for God again, like get up and start planting some seeds. Like it's okay to sit during the winter. It's okay to not necessarily be engaged and serving and doing a lot of things in the winter because you might just be at a place where you need to hear from God. But I want to tell you, as you transition out of that winter season, like get involved, like be plowing and planting because God is on the move. Don't stay in winter. And when God's bringing you out of winter, maintain your vitality by planting. That is us doing our work, and God is also doing His work, right? He's planting things in you. There's a freshness, there's an awareness, an attentiveness in you that God is planting, so we be sensitive to God's work in our lives. And then I'll just mention this one. It's also the time of cleaning, isn't it? We call it that, spring cleaning. We saw moral renewal. Spring cleaning is a fresh start. It's a renewed purpose. So what do we do in those seasons? We like remove the clutter. Spring is a great time to examine your soul, to ask yourself those fresh questions. When do I feel the closest to God? When do I feel the furthest from God? Like spring's the time to be attentive and ask yourself those questions. What is God doing in my life? Spring is a time to declutter life and begin to understand your spiritual rhythm. Here's how God teaches me. Here's where I learn. These are the ways in which I should invest my gifts and my talents. God is doing His work. He is also cleansing your heart as we listen. Spring is the time where I want to open up my heart to God and say, show me the dark corners. Show me where I'm not living in faith to you. Show me the 5%, the 10%, the 15% that I'm holding back. Like, God, do your work in me. Spring's the time to ask those questions. You know why? Because I'm attentive. I'm listening. God's renewing my heart. He's making things new in my life. Cleaning. It's springtime. Springtime of the soul. Wake up. Strengthen your feeble hands. Steady your shaking knees. Experience the freshness of renewal and get to work. Plowing, purging, cleansing. Now, let me end this message with Isaiah's image of what happens in the springtime of the soul. We read it. I'll just reference it again. A highway shall be there. It shall be called the way of holiness. And then he picks up in 10. The ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be on their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. At the end of all this, Isaiah gives us two images. The image of a highway and the image of a homecoming. Now, why is he talking about a highway in the middle of a desert? It doesn't seem to make sense, does it? Highway in the middle of a desert. What is the purpose of a highway? The purpose of a highway is to make hard places easier to access. To make difficult places easier to access. You need a highway to get there. The springtime offers us a highway to get to places in our spiritual life, to abide in Christ in the seasons of our soul. Like, we get this. Ash and I had the opportunity a few years ago now, before Levi, through my company and some awards and things that they gave, that we went to Hawaii for a week together. And we took in Maui, there's this famous excursion you can do called the Road to Hana. So Hana is like this little town on the other side of the island, and thousands of people travel it almost every day. So there's two ways to Hana. There's the way that everyone goes, and then there's this like crazy little dirt road that goes over the back side of the island and comes out in Hana. And so we are kind of like talking to some locals, and they're like, you got to take the back road to Hana. And man, it was a crazy experience trying to travel on a road that's not a road, right? It's just like a dirt path, and there's times you have to stop and get out and make sure that your car is going to make it across, and hairpin turns around the cliffs and all those things. And then we came back the traditional way from Hana. And the journey back outside of traffic took us, I don't know, a third of the time as the road going. Why? Because there was a highway that was built from Hana back to the main portion of Maui that people traveled on. Two entirely different experiences to the same direction. And Isaiah gives us this image of a highway, that God is doing things to give us direction and access, that following God in the springtime becomes a delight and not a burden. A delight and not a burden. And then this other image of a homecoming. Now, in Isaiah's words, this was after a long exile of God's people. It was after a long winter season. And Isaiah says God's people will return home. And when they come home, there will be life and vitality and rejoicing and dancing. There's nothing quite like a homecoming, is there? There's nothing like being reunited with people you haven't seen and people that you love. And I'm talking here in the context about people that you want to see and you do love, right? Not some of the family reunions you get thrown into. I'm talking about people that you do want to be around, that you do love. We experienced this recently when Kaylee was gone for several months studying abroad, and she came home, and like little Levi's trying to wrap his mind around his big sister being gone. And every time we mention Kaylee's name, his response is, uh-oh, which means like she's not here. And so we kept building it up. The day that Kaylee was going to come home, she's going to come home, she's going to come home, and KK's coming home, and KK's coming home, and KK's coming home. And when KK finally came home and walked in the door, some of you saw the video on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, little Levi comes sprinting across the room, KK, and she picks him up, and they hug and embrace, like it's just a little glimpse, a little picture of the beauty of a homecoming. And Isaiah paints a picture here. There's nothing quite like a homecoming. So I want to encourage you today. I want to encourage you. If you're in the winter season of the soul, if you're in the springtime season of the soul, I just want to say to you, like, welcome home. Like, this is your family. This is brothers and sisters on the journey. We're going through the seasons of life, and we say to you, welcome home. God is on the move.